What if the sources we're looking at today, top advisors, congressional analysts, are saying that this huge international organization, funded mostly by American taxpayers, isn't just inefficient? What if they argue it's actively working against American interests, against national security?
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a fascinating stack of sources. We've got major presidential speeches, detailed congressional analyses, policy reports, and they all share this really specific, quite aggressive viewpoint. They frame the United Nations and the current global asylum system not just as, flawed or needing tweaks, but as a direct threat to American sovereignty. Our mission here isn't to agree or disagree, but just to synthesize what these very critical documents are actually demanding.
Yeah, and this deep dive is incredibly timely for you, the listener, because we're essentially analyzing the shockwaves from a cluster of events back on September 23rd, 2025. That day really signaled a major policy earthquake, didn't it?
It really did. That was the day the president gave that, combative speech at the UN General Assembly. He pretty much went on the offensive. He openly questioned the whole point of the UN, slammed it for inaction on peace, and then crucially accused it of funding and enabling mass migration.
And that's the key connection we're tracking, right? Because at the exact same time as that very public speech, these detailed policy papers were released. They demanded the U.S. completely overhaul its asylum laws. I mean, really aggressively, even suggesting withdrawal from the 1967 Refugee Protocol, all under this banner of America First.
Exactly. And what's really striking is how these sources frame the core conflict. They basically say governments are now being forced into a corner. They have to choose either stick with what these sources call outdated kind of globalist obligations or actively protect their own national borders and, domestic stability.
So the underlying message is that sovereign nations need to put their own security first.
That's the argument, yes. Prioritize their own national security, their social cohesion. And sometimes that means confronting these international bodies that currently set the global rules.
Okay, so let's dig into the first big theme here, which really starts with the money, the financial critique. Because the sources, well, they paint the UN bureaucracy as this miasma of corruption. That's the phrase they use. The core problem, according to these reports, is that after, 50-plus years, the whole system is just crippled. Crippled by inefficiency, corruption, and they actually label it a Kafkaesque bureaucracy.
And they give this failure structure a name, too.
Yeah.
The unholy trinity of waste, fraud, and abuse. The analysts argue that diplomatic attempts at reform, they've failed. Again and again, polite requests, diplomatic chats, useless, according to them.
So negotiation is off the table in their view.
Pretty much. They conclude the U.S. has only one real tool left. It's financial clout, financial leverage.
Right. And when you look at the numbers they provide, you can see why they might land there. They talk about this fundamental disconnect between power and purse.
They cite figures showing the U.S. assessed at, 25% of the general budget back then?
Yeah, back in 92, that's a figure, 25%.
While 79 other countries,
Yeah.
member states, each paid just 0.01%. Tiny amounts.
Exactly. So America's footing a quarter of the bill, but its influence gets diluted by, dozens and dozens of nations paying practically nothing.
Which explains why the recommendations are so
Well,
extreme.
yeah.
These legislative proposals designed to force change.
Absolutely. The analysts lay out 5 key actions. Things like withholding all payments until the new Secretary General proves, concretely, that they're committed to sweeping reform.
All payments, that's drastic.
It is. They also demand a full, comprehensive audit. And maybe the most dramatic part, announcing a unilateral 50% cut in the U.S. contribution, permanent cut, once the current backlog of payments, the arrearages, are cleared.
Wow. They really use the phrase, put the UN into bankruptcy, if necessary, to force reform. They do, because they argue the waste isn't just occasional, it's structural. It's visible everywhere, right down to basic staffing costs. Take salaries. The average pay for a UN computer analyst, according to these reports, is $111,500.
Okay.
But outside that UN bubble, a similar job averages around $56,835.
So nearly double.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The reports argue these UN jobs come with this massive global premium. It suggests the system is set up for, maybe elite comfort rather than lean efficiency. An Assistant Secretary General gets $140,256. That's significantly more than the mayor of New York City makes.
And does that higher pay lead to better work? According to the sources, no. Often the opposite.
Right. They quote the former Secretary General Boutros Ghali himself. He apparently stated publicly that perhaps half of the UN workforce does nothing useful.
Half the workforce. That's
Yeah.
stunning if true.
It explains a lot, according to the analysis. It explains why, when Inspector General Karl Paschke finally did manage to get an interim report out, one of the first real attempts at cost accounting in 50 years, he found $16.8 million in just straight-up fraud and waste.
In how long?
In just 7 months. And think about the examples they give. $369,000 paid out for fuel services in Somalia that never actually happened, never provided.
And those are American tax dollars.
That's the point they hammer home. American tax dollars funding failure and, in some cases, outright theft.
But the critique doesn't just stop at the budget sheets, does it? If the internal issues weren't enough, the president's main attack line focused on the UN's alleged direct role in the migration crisis, accusing it of actively undermining national sovereignty.
Yes, the sources definitely indicate the president saw uncontrolled migration as maybe the #1 political issue driving policy at that time. And in that General Assembly speech, he didn't mince words. He explicitly accused the UN of funding an assault on Western countries of their borders.
Funding an assault.
Yeah, and he drew this really sharp line. The UN is supposed to stop invasions and not create them and not finance them.
That's a powerful accusation. What does financing mean in this context? What specifically are they pointing to?
Well, the allegation, laid out in these documents, is that the UN is directly helping illegal entry by providing essential things like food, shelter, transportation, and debit cards to illegal aliens who are moving towards and across the U.S. border.
So the argument is that this UN support acts like a magnet.
Essentially, yes. That it incentivizes the journey, making the border problem worse, not better.
And the narrative then contrasts this alleged UN failure with what they frame as a domestic success story. The policy reports boast about a massive drop in illegal crossings at the southern border.
Right. They said a 94% decline in illegal alien apprehensions in just 1 month under the new administration.
94%.
Yeah, and they contrast that sharply with the previous year's number for the same month, which was apparently over 140,000.
But then they pivot to Europe as a kind of cautionary tale.
Exactly. Europe is held up as the negative example. It received over 1 million asylum requests in 2023. And the analysts explicitly link this huge influx to serious domestic problems. They cite rising crime rates, pointing to Germany specifically.
What are the German stats they use?
They claim non-citizens commit over 40% of crimes in Germany, despite being only about 15% of the population. The link they're drawing is direct. Globalist migration policies, they argue, lead to domestic instability and crime.
So first the financial critique, then the migration crisis link. And if that wasn't enough, the sources then hit hard on military failures. The UN's role in conflict resolution is portrayed as, well, deeply flawed.
Utterly lacking is the phrase used in some reports. The UN peacekeeping record is called a chronicle of failure. These operations get criticized for being ill-equipped, often without clear command structures or even basic uniform training standards.
And worse than just ineffective.
Worse, the sources argue, is that the UN often stops being impartial and becomes part of the conflict itself. They give examples: the manhunt for General Aidid in Somalia, or UN forces essentially ending up at war with the Bosnian Serbs in Bosnia. They become a combatant, but without the political accountability a national army would have.
Which brings it right back to U.S. policy again.
Right. Given that track record, the recommendation from these analysts is stark. Congress needs to pass laws that explicitly prohibit U.S. troops from participating in any UN military operations.
Why? What's the reasoning?
The argument is these missions rarely help core U.S. interests, and they often put American soldiers under questionable, ineffective command structures.
And the president himself highlighted this perceived irrelevance.
He did in that same speech. He claimed his administration ended 7 wars in 7 months, citing examples like Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Israeli-Iran tensions, and then he said the UN did not even try to help in any of them, the implication being their military arm was just absent when actual peace deals were being brokered.
Okay, so this paints a picture of international failure that, according to these sources, has direct consequences for our domestic laws, especially asylum. The policy reports argue that the whole U.S. asylum system is basically driven by this outdated framework from after World War II, specifically the 1967 Protocol. And the conclusion they draw is that the U.S. has effectively surrendered control over immigration policy to human traffickers and economic migrants. Strong words.
Very strong. And we should probably pause for a second just to clarify that protocol for you, the listener. The 1967 Protocol is the main international agreement defining who qualifies as a refugee. It's about fleeing persecution based on specific things.
Yeah.
Race, religion, political opinion, and so on.
Right.
The sources argue this agreement is now totally outdated and being exploited by people who are primarily economic migrants, not genuine refugees fleeing persecution.
So to fix this, what do they propose?
They say the U.S. has to reclaim its sovereignty here. And the first step, a huge one, is that the U.S. must withdraw from the 1967 Protocol entirely, and then consequently amend the U.S. Refugee Act of 1980.
Withdraw completely. That would dramatically narrow who's eligible for asylum, wouldn't it? Focusing only on that core definition of persecution.
It would be a massive structural change, yes. And Congress is urged to take another specific step. Eliminate the category of membership of a particular social group.
Why that category specifically?
The analysts call it an ambiguous catch-all loophole. They argue it's constantly exploited, allowing all sorts of unfounded claims, especially economic ones, to just flood the system. So by removing it, protection would be laser-focused on those clear core grounds: race, religion, political opinion, nationality.
Okay, so they want to change the legal definition. What about the actual process at the border? How do they propose regaining control there? They mention successful models elsewhere, like Australia or that Italy-Albania deal.
Right. The procedural changes are key. First, and this is fundamental, amend the law so that anyone who crosses the border illegally is prohibited from even applying for asylum inside the U.S.
So all claims must be made properly at a port of entry.
That's the proposal. No reward for illegal entry. Second, DHS must be required, not just allowed, but required, to detain all inadmissible asylum seekers while their cases are processed.
No more catch and release.
Exactly. Prevent people from being paroled into the country and then, potentially disappearing.
But what if the detention centers fill up? That's always been a practical challenge.
The sources address that directly. They say DHS must be authorized, legally empowered, to immediately expel any subsequent illegal arrivals back to Mexico once detention capacity is hit. Strict enforcement.
Like a one in, one out kind of capacity limit?
Something like that, yes.
Yeah.
And crucially, the legislation must also disqualify what they call asylum shoppers, meaning people who traveled through multiple safe countries on their way here without claiming asylum there first, or people who were already safely settled somewhere else before deciding to come to the U.S. The idea is to stop people from picking the U.S. purely for economic reasons or convenience.
And the final piece seems to be managing the sheer number of applications, a hard limit.
Exactly. The whole proposed overhaul includes setting a combined annual cap on all asylum and refugee applications together.
And that cap wouldn't be arbitrary.
No, it must be tied directly, they argue, to America's actual verifiable capacity to properly vet people, process their cases, and successfully assimilate them. No more open-ended numbers driven by global events. It has to be based on what the U.S. can realistically handle.
So pulling all these threads together from the sources, the core message seems to be this demand for a really fundamental, almost revolutionary choice. Will the U.S., as they see it, keep submitting financially and legally to this UN structure and these international asylum rules that they depict as inefficient and hostile to U.S. interests? Or will it follow these very aggressive proposals, use its financial muscle, assert national sovereignty, and build basically demonstrably secure borders?
That's the crossroads presented in these documents. The analysts clearly see this as a critical moment. National security, in their view, is now directly tied to potentially dismantling participation in these international frameworks that, they argue, have just proven detrimental to American interests.
It's certainly a dramatic choice laid out here, but the sources are insistent. If the United Nations really must be put into bankruptcy, if necessary, to force reform, as these policy papers explicitly suggest, well, it forces us to ask you, the taxpayer, a tough question. What specific actions, financial or legislative, would you actually support right now to ensure that American money only goes to programs that genuinely serve U.S. interests as defined by these critical analyses? Something to think about.